Do you have any patients like Betty
in your practice?
Well,
yes, quite a few.
Well,
Dr. Smith, today I'd like to tell you why new Vivex is the drug of choice in patients like Betty. Vivex offers your patients proven, unsurpassed clinical efficacy.
Historically, new medications produce great hope, but we have to make sure there's not too much hype involved as well.
Pharmaceutical companies produce a lot of very beneficial products. The problem is they go well beyond that to create ever new markets and expand the markets that they have. For example, a very high percentage of prescribing is what's called off-label. That means for purposes that were not approved by the FDA. So isn't it strange? We have this whole federal program for testing for safety and efficacy for specific conditions. Then once the drug is approved, it can be prescribed for anything.
The drug industry has put an awful lot of muscle on Congress and on the FDA to keep drugs that are profitable on the market. For a doctor like me, it puts us in an impossible position because drugs that should have been withdrawn may last for months or even years beyond the point where we knew they were dangerous.
A couple of years ago, there were about 600 registered pharmaceutical lobbyists. Today, only a few years later, according to USA Today, there are over 1,200 registered pharmaceutical lobbyists.
There are more lobbyists for the pharmaceutical industry in Washington than there are members of Congress. They have enormous checkbooks, and they can spend that money as they see fit. What do lobbyists do? Well, they influence legislators.
They are paying visits to members of Congress and their staff and sort of influencing them to do things the drug industry way, such as forbidding price controls on prescription drugs. In addition to that, the drug companies themselves give money to the members of Congress, and in return they get much more sympathy, both in terms of legislation that may be pending and in terms of the oversight or lack thereof that the Congress exerts over the FDA.
You've got to start to ask, could we have a better regulatory regime here that could protect the public interest more than the profits of the pharmaceutical companies? You have this entanglement at almost every level of medicine. And where it's most pernicious is at the level of the medical journals, which are at the top of the hierarchy. Medical journals are essentially the record of medical science. And even those journals are heavily dependent on drug company funding through advertising.
Scientific studies that are funded by industry are 5 times more likely to show a result that's favorable to drug companies than if the study was funded by an independent source like the National Institutes of Health.
A pharmaceutical company does a drug test, and it gets, or maybe it does 8 studies, let's say, and 6 of them are negative. Well, it publishes the 2 positive ones. So we only have 2 positive results, and the public and doctors, in fact, the medical journals themselves don't know that in 6 of the 8 trials the drug failed.
The Eli Lilly Corporation, a pharmaceutical company, for nearly 15 years covered up their own internal investigation that showed that anyone on Prozac is 12 times more likely to attempt suicide than those using other antidepressants. Not 12 times more than the average population, 12 times more than those already on other antidepressants. This is a criminal act, and I want to know why these criminals are still walking the streets.
At the beginning, I was diagnosed with dysthymia by a therapist, though not by a psychiatrist, and then she suggested medication. The psychiatrist diagnosed me with depression, I guess severe depression at one point. And then I started taking Prozac. At one point, I just started feeling, I couldn't point my finger on it, but I just started feeling weird, just not right. I was having really paranoid thoughts. A week later, I just started to act weird. I started to be manic, and I went to work, and everything that everybody said was just like this deep thing. Like, I read into it whatever I wanted to read into it. I would look at people and I would think, wow, I've been really mean to you the whole time I've worked here, which, I mean, I hadn't, but this is what I'm thinking, and I start crying. Meanwhile, the conversation we're having is, how's your day? How was your day? Oh, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. Meanwhile, I'm looking at him, like, crying. And everyone knew I wasn't quite right.
Under the guise of training, the drug companies pay for professorships. In some cases, they support whole laboratories and universities. They pay for the distribution of major journals, such as the Archives of General Psychiatry, which is sent to all psychiatrists in the country free of charge because a drug company pays for it.
I left work that